offering weeknight programs here at the museum. This is new for us, so thank you for coming. My name is Mariah Berlinga-Shevchuk. I'm the head of public engagement here at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I'm very pleased to announce our speaker tonight, Gillian Perry. I don't have your bio memorized, so I'm so sorry, but Gillian is the co-founder of the Anne Frank Legacy in the UK and works with the Anne Frank Center here in the United States to ensure that the legacy of Anne Frank is appreciated and known in all 50 states. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gillian. She's got a great lecture for us tonight. We'll do a Q&A after. There are books available for purchase should you want to, and Gillian is going to sign them after as well. So enjoy. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
How lovely to see you all. It's my first visit to Portland. So I'm really, really excited to be here. I haven't come directly from London, I have to say. My son and his family live down in the Santa Cruz Mountains near Silicon Valley. My son works in Silicon Valley. So I come out twice a year and I'm based there. And when I come out, I tend to do a lot of talk, a lot of speaking. And as Mariah said, I was the co-founder in 1990, and for 26 years, for my sins, I was the executive director of the Anne Frank Trust UK, the partner organisation of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. And I started it, just a little bit of background, I started it from my desk in my home on the south coast of England, Walnes, and from my study, and built it up over 26 years. When I retired in 2016, we had 35 members of staff taking Anne Frank's story to schools, to communities, and even to prisons. We did wonderful programs in prisons all over the UK. So I'm very proud of the team that are still continuing to take Anne Frank's legacy out to the world. And now I work in tandem with the Anne Frank Centre in the UK. And as Mariah just mentioned, we have such an exciting project to have a real profound Anne Frank educational programme in all 50 states of this country by 2029. And the reason it's 2029 is that will mark the centenary of Anne Frank's birth in 1929. So hopefully we're going to have a significant presence in Oregon too. I hope so. So let's get started. What I'm going to do is my talk to you tonight is going to be essentially in two parts. Mainly I'm going to be talking about Anne, the girl, and really bringing her to life to you. Not just as the name, the iconic symbol of the Holocaust, but as a living human being, fleshing her out, her family background, etc., and the life she was living even before the family went into hiding. I've had great privilege of meeting and knowing many people who actually knew Anne personally, including her first cousin, Woody Elias, who was a great friend of mine, who lived in Switzerland. He died a few years ago. They were very close as first cousins, and the great privilege of spending time with one of the courageous helpers of the Frank family in hiding, that was Mrs. Peace. So I count her as a person in my life that had a really significant influence. And also Eva Schloss, who's one of my co-founders of the Anne Frank Trust. And Eva is now 94 years old. She'll be 95 this year. Direct contemporary of Anne Frank's. She knew Anne Frank. They played together in Amsterdam. Two families were both refugee families. Eva's from Austria, Anne's of course from Germany. And they lived in the same development, the apartment development in Reverdeplein, which you'll see in a minute. And Eva and Anne, they weren't bosom buddies because they were very different in temperament, different girls, but the same age. And after the war, Eva's mother married Mr. Frank, the widower. Her mother was a widow, he was a widower, and it was a tremendous love story. Eva came to live in London, and she was one of the co-founders. For many, many years, she was travelling, telling her story, but sadly over the past few months she has been very incapacitated. She's nearly 95, and so she doesn't travel anymore. She hardly leaves her own home. And this is really something that's very sad about the many Holocaust survivors that we have worked with over the years, and I'm sure it's the same here at this museum, that they are dwindling in number. Every year we lose more and more survivors, and those that are still with us are increasingly frail and can't go out and tell their stories anymore. So it's beholden to us and the second generation, and also the young people that we're educating to tell those stories. So that was the first part of my talk. Is going to be about the Frank family. But the last part of my talk, I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the world. So I hope you brought your suitcases with you, because we're going to go travelling, and we're going to have a little potted history of the impact of Anne's legacy in some really surprising places, and that's the legacy part of the talk. So let's get going and hope that technology doesn't let us down.
How old were you when you, I mean, she's 94, were you like 15 when you helped co-found this?
I'll say no more. I'm here visiting my teenage grandchildren, so right, so I can't tell you the story of Anne Frank without talking very much about this man, and I always say that he's the reason that I'm standing here in front of you. And this, of course, is Otto Frank, and I was delighted to see a wonderful photograph of him, a very iconic photograph that we'll see in this presentation as well when I was walking around the museum earlier. So there's Otto on the left as a young man with his two adored daughters, Margot on the left and Anne on the right. And there he is as an older man after the war. Now, Otto was born in 1889 in Frankfurt, same year as Hitler, actually. And he was born into a very acculturalized and assimilated German Jewish family, who the family had come out of the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto about 100 years before Otto and his two brothers and sister were born. And by the time they were born, Otto and his siblings, the family was so embedded in Frankfurt society that Otto's father, Michael Frank, didn't just work in a bank, he actually owned a bank, a small private investment bank, the Michael Frank Bank. And it was so highly regarded that one of the customers was none other than Kaiser Wilhelm himself. So that's the sort of family we're talking about that is so embedded in German society. Now, as a young man, Otto went off to study at Heidelberg University. There he is, looking quite dapper, don't you think? It must be so uncomfortable, those starched icons. I can just see young men wearing those now. And there he met a young American, a man called Nathan Strauss, nicknamed Charlie. They shared a dormitory, and they got very friendly. Nathan Strauss, as you can probably guess, was Jewish. And Nathan invited his new friend Otto to come over to New York and do some work experience for his father. His father, there's a couple of seats at the front here. His father owned quite a well-known store in New York, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. It was called Macy's. And I always make a point of when I'm in New York, I go to Macy's and I walk into the store through the actual very doorway on the right. I took this photo myself, that Otto would have breezed in as a young man with his head held high, thinking that, all the wonderful things life would have in store for him. Now, he absolutely loved New York as a young man, as a young European man. He loved its sort of vibrancy and its brashness, and he probably would have stayed and become an American citizen had not, in 1909, his father, Michael Frank, died very suddenly, and Otto was called back to Frankfurt to help run the family business. he wasn't a born banker. Banking didn't really interest him. He was much more a small entrepreneur. He loved small businesses. And, but nonetheless, he felt the responsibility to go and help his family that needed him. So he went back in 1909 to Europe. But after a few years, things changed, because in 1914, World War I broke out. And Otto, of course, fought for the Germans. He was a proud German, let's not forget. And he fought so valiantly in World War I that by the end of the war, he had been promoted to the rank of lieutenant and received the Iron Cross for bravery, which didn't help him some 20 years later. Now, of course, immediately after the war, the German economy suffered terribly, and the bank by the early 1920s was already on its knees and failing. So Otto was sort of dabbling in other businesses. But nonetheless, the Frank family still had such a good reputation and high regard in German society that Otto married in 1925 the daughter of a very wealthy industrialist from Aachen. And the young couple met at a party and actually got engaged 2 months later and were soon married. They had a beautiful society wedding, and Otto and Edith, his lovely bride, went off to San Remo in Italy for a honeymoon. The following year, their first child, Margot, was born. Beautiful little brown-eyed, brown-haired baby. And 3 years later, in June 1929, their second child, Anneliese Marie, was born. Now, her name was soon shortened to Anne, as we know her, but they would have pronounced it in the continental way of Anna. So little Anna was born in June 1929. And this photo on the right of her sleeping so innocently in her bed, aged about 3 or 4, I find terribly poignant, because she's sleeping so innocently with no idea what life has in store for her. Now, this photograph was actually taken in Frankfurt in March 1933. And they are on a sort of outing into the town centre. There's Edith with the 2 girls. Edith sort of looking stoically, trying to raise a smile at the camera. And Margot on the right, sort of just staring at the camera. But I think you'll agree that Anne has probably just had enough of having a photo taken and is scowling at the camera. They were probably family outing, maybe to do some shopping in the city centre, or maybe to have some lunch in a cafe. But by the time this photo was taken, their lives had changed radically, because in January 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. On the 5th of March 1933, at the same month as that photo was taken, the Nazi Party is elected into power. Or we call it elected, but it was hardly democratic. And then almost immediately, they start taking measures against Germany's Jewish population. And of course, anybody who opposes the new regime is sent off to work camp. Now, those measures against the Jews are so swift that by the summer of 1933, Otto Frank, whose family had done so well in Germany, starts to realise that there is no future for his family in the country of his birth. But where to go? Well, he looked very favourably at the Netherlands, and there were several reasons for this. Firstly, the country had been neutral during the First World War. Secondly, it had a long history of tolerance of other religions. So, for example, after the Spanish expulsion of the Jews, many found their way at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th centuries to Amsterdam, which was a noted tolerant city. And it was the Jews that helped build Amsterdam into the great trading city that it became. In the 18th century, even though it was a Protestant country, it was still very welcoming to Catholics, which is very unusual. So it had a reputation as a country where there was tolerance. Now, on a more pragmatic note, Otto had done business in Amsterdam in the early 20s, and so he knew the city, had contacts there. And also, things, sometimes fall into place. His brother-in-law, who was Swiss, worked for a German company that was looking to open an office in Amsterdam. And they were looking for a manager. Now, the company was called Opecta, and it manufactured a product called pectin. Now, I'm going to ask you if anyone knows what pectin is. Yes. What is it? Yes, that's right. It's a natural setting agent for jams and jellies. When I give this talk to schools and I ask, anyone know what pectin is? They look at me with completely blank faces because they just go to Walmart or Safeways and buy their jams and jellies. But in Europe in the 1930s, this was a very popular product because the Dutch would go into the country and pick their fruit seasonally, and they would bottle it, preserve it for the winter. But later on, he went into business with another German Jewish refugee who was importing spices for sausages. And again, the Dutch liked to make their sausages at home. So that was another business opportunity. So things were falling into place. So he goes to Amsterdam in the summer of 1933, only a few months after Hitler's been, after the Nazis had been voted in, to open an office and look for somewhere to live. And then later on in that year, Edith comes to Amsterdam with Margot, and Anne follows in early 1934. So Otto finds an apartment to rent in a very modern new development called the Merwedeplein in the south of the city. And possibly what attracted him to it was the nearest thing in Amsterdam to a New York skyscraper that he could find, with that tall building at the end. And it was a very modern development. It had central heating and hot and cold running water, which was a very attractive proposition. So quite a few German and Austrian refugees found themselves living in the same development. And in the middle of the apartment blocks was this lovely square of grass where the youngsters would go and play together and the families would congregate. Now, the statue of Anne wasn't there at the time, of course not, no one knew who she was, but it was put up by the owner of the local bookstore around the corner. More about that a bit later on. So Anne starts kindergarten and then elementary school, just around the corner. It was a Montessori school. Montessori method of education appealed to the Frank family. They thought it would be very good for them. Very bright, very chatty daughter, very creative daughter, because it was a balance of formal education, but also creativity and informality. You can see that the children are sitting around tables rather than informal desk pattern, and there's the teacher sitting amongst them. If you look very carefully in the centre of the photo, you'll see Anne sitting in the middle there. Now, I have to tell you, she wasn't your ideal pupil at school. She was quite disruptive in class. She had a penchant for talking, and she was often kept behind by her teachers, and she describes it in her diary. She was kept behind to do lines for disrupting the class. She loved the social aspects of school, let's put it that way. And that school actually, it's still a school around the corner. You can go and visit it when you're in Amsterdam. And it's now known as the Anne Frank School. And by the way, the writing on the wall wasn't put up there by a disruptive teenager as graffiti. It's actually put up by the school because it replicates Anne's writing in her diary. And she loved her friends. She loved playing with her friends. And there was quite a social life for her in the Merwedeplein. And you can probably recognise the buildings there. So the picture on the left, there's Anne in the light-coloured outfit, and her friend Susanna Lederman in the dark outfit with a hoop. And you can see they're playing with a scooter. Well, not very different from the toys that children play with now. My grandson recently got his first scooter. And on the right, there's Anne on the right with her doll, little Susanna in the middle, and another friend called Eva. Now, photographs. People often say to me, how come there are so many photos of Anne and Margot growing up? Many, many more than my father took on his old box Brownie of us growing up. That was because Otto was a very keen amateur photographer. He bought himself an expensive Leica in the 1920s and loved taking photos of his girls. And you can actually see, if you look at the bottom right of the right-hand picture, it says shadow. And you see his little shadow, the shadow of his head, in many of the photos. How did those photos survive? Well, before the family went into hiding, of course there were no photos once they went into hiding, before they went into hiding, Otto sent a big trunk of photographs to his family in Switzerland, who looked after them, and then returned them to Otto after the war. So that's how we have this incredible resource of wonderful photographs that feed all the exhibitions, all the books, everything you see about Anne Frank. You go to the Anne Frank house, you'll see these wonderful, wonderful photographs. Now, the Frank girls were having a lovely life growing up in Amsterdam, away from the horrors in Germany. They loved to visit the seaside town of Zandvoort, still a popular seaside resort, 30 minutes on the train from the centre of Amsterdam. And I find this photo on the left very poignant of the two girls staring out to sea and possibly thinking about their futures. And in the winter they would ice skate on the frozen canals. Now Margot was very academic, very clever girl, very studious, but she was also very sporty. And she belonged to a rowing club and a tennis club, and she had a great social life within those clubs as well. And of course, later on, she had to leave those clubs because they wouldn't have Jews. Now, this photograph was taken on the 12th of June 1939 on Anne's 10th birthday, and there she is celebrating with her girlfriends. Of course, it was not in colour at the time, but it was hand-coloured. I found it on the internet, and I think it's absolutely gorgeous to see these girls in bright-coloured dresses, which really brings them to life. So you can probably recognise Anne in the green dress, second from the left. And then on the far left is Jacqueline Van Marsen, who she talks about in her diary, her friend Jacques. Jacqueline Van Marsen is still alive, same age as Anne, she would be, 95. She lives in Amsterdam. I've had the pleasure of meeting her a couple of times. And the other side of Anne's, we're moving towards the right, the little girl in the white dress, you probably recognise from those previous photos, that was her friend Susanna Lederman. Now, Susanna and her family were deported to Auschwitz in 1943, and little Susanna was gassed on arrival in Auschwitz. The slightly taller girl is next to her is Hannah Pitt-Goslar, Lies Goosens in Anne's diary, and Hannah died just over a year ago, and she went to Israel and became a nurse. She fulfilled her ambition of becoming a nurse in Israel. Again, I've met her a couple of times in London. She was a lovely lady. Now, the 5 girls on the right are Anne's non-Jewish friends, because at the time of this picture, she could mix freely with non-Jewish girls. And interestingly, the tall girl in the middle of the picture, by the time that photo was taken, her father had already joined the Dutch Nazi Party. Now, just 11 months after that happy photo was taken, the unthinkable happens. May 1940, the Germans bomb the strategic port of Rotterdam. They bomb it so intensively that after 5 days, the city is almost flattened. The Dutch capitulate, and the Germans march into the Netherlands. The government, the Dutch government, and the Dutch royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, go into exile in London. Now, for a few weeks, a couple of months, things remain quite calm, but very soon measures against the Dutch Jews start. And by 1941, due to the restrictive measures, Anne and Margot have to leave their school. They must only attend a Jewish school. Mr. Frank has to hand his business over to his non-Jewish employees. Now, he's very lucky that he has two managers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who are incredibly loyal and trustworthy. So they are running the business in name, because Jews are not allowed to own a business. But in fact, Mr. Frank is still keeping a benign eye on the business. Now, in February 1942, there are worries about Margot. Margot turns 16. And in that very month, the German occupiers issue a directive that all Dutch young Jews aged between 60 and 40 must report to be sent to a work camp in the east, in Germany. And as it happened, the work camp was a euphemism, because very few of those young people ever returned. So Mr. and Mrs. Frank start worrying about what they can do. There's no way they can get out of the Netherlands. All doors are closed, Europe is at war, and even before the German invasion, they tried to get out of Germany in 1933, even though Otto was still close to the very influential Strauss family of New York. They could not get visas to get them out to America. So there was nowhere to go. But Mr. Kugler, one of his managers, reminds Mr. Frank that in the building, the office and warehouse building in the Prinsengracht, which is in the heart of Amsterdam, the centre of Amsterdam. Prinsengracht, by the way, the street is Prince's Canal. It's on the canal. And you can see the blue highlighted building is Mr. Frank's office, 263 Prinsengracht. One of those old Dutch buildings. And at the back and top, you can see those eaves, are a set of rooms that people have forgotten that they're actually there. The staff never go up and use them. So Mr. Kugler suggests that if Margot gets a call-up, that would be an ideal hiding place. So over the following months, they start preparing a hiding place in case Margot gets one of these dreaded call-up papers. And it's not as easy as it sounds, because bear in mind that they have to do this when the office workers have gone, everyone's gone home for the evening. And these buildings, these old Dutch 17th century merchant buildings, very steep buildings, very tall, very steep. If you've been to Amsterdam, the stairs are very, very steep. And by the way, if you visit the Anne Frank house, there's no disabled access at all. You literally have to climb all those stairs. So it wasn't an easy thing, because if you look up, if you're walking around Amsterdam, you look up at the buildings, at the top of every building is a hook. And that hook was for ropes to hoist up furniture. Excuse me. But they couldn't do this when they were creating a hiding place. They couldn't draw attention. So it wasn't easy. And then Mr. Kugler suggests, what if they conceal the door of the hiding place with a bookcase? And the bookcase, they could put all kinds of files and folders. And once the family had gone into hiding, through that door behind the bookcase, they could close this bookcase and conceal the door. So that's what they actually do. And it's actually the father of Bepp, who's one of Otto's trusted office workers, who happens to be a carpenter, and he builds the bookcase. So they create this hiding place. But as yet, Margot has not received any call-up. And in June, Anne is going to celebrate her 13th birthday. Now, a few days before her birthday, she's walking in the area, and in the window of the local bookstore, which, by the way, is still a bookstore, she spots something that she rather fancies as a gift. And it's this: a little fabric-covered check notebook. And probably what attracted her to it was, can you see, a brass lock? What 13-year-old girl that's going to write her most intimate thoughts in her notebook doesn't want a lock to keep prying eyes away? So she drops a few hints to her dad, as our kids do when it's coming up to Hanukkah or Christmas or their birthdays. And sure enough, Mr. Frank goes back to the bookstore and he buys the notebook. And Mr. and Mrs. Frank present it to Anne on her 13th birthday, along with the other gifts. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a little bit from my book, The Legacy of Anne Frank, about what happens next when she receives the notebook. Glasses on. Anne, let me see if I can just... I've got something to lean on and I can hold the mic. Anne started writing in her notebook on the day she received it. Her first words were, "I hope I'll be able to confide everything in you, as I've never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you'll be a great source of comfort and support." She had no idea on that day that in 3 weeks' time, the diary was about to become a vital source of comfort and support. Anne goes on to describe her birthday party and all the gifts she received over the next few days. She shares her privately held views about her school friends. On this matter, she doesn't hold back, using adjectives such as stuck up, sneaky, and vulgar for some of her unfortunate targets. By the 20th of June, Anne has given her new paper confidant the name Kitty, after one of the characters created by her favourite author. Kitty is to become her friend, a surprising confession from a girl who says she has about 30 friends and a throng of boy admirers who can't keep their eyes off me. But with her human friends, she feels the talk is superficial and about ordinary everyday things. Kitty will be her true friend. Paper will be her intimate confidant. And anyway, no one's ever going to read it. 3 weeks after Anne had started her diary, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 5th of July, the doorbell on the Frank family's apartment unexpectedly rang. It was a postman delivering the dreaded notice for 16-year-old Margot to report at midnight for transportation to a work camp. According to the notice, she would be permitted to take a number of specified items in a single suitcase, which had to have the first and last name, the date of birth, and the word Holland written on it. In a foreboding of the true fate of the deportees, this was explained to be important because the owner's suitcase would be sent by a separate train. The hindsight of history gives us a grim insight into these bureaucratic instructions. By this time, not only Auschwitz, but Belzec and Chelmno concentration camps were fully functional in carrying out the extermination of Jews. The very next day, early on the morning of the 6th of July, Otto, Edith and Anne left their Moveda plane home together and trudged in the pouring rain across the city of the Prinsengracht offices of Apecta. They were each wearing several layers of clothing and carrying one satchel, plus another bag laden with essential items. The city was dark and people were scuttling about to get out of the rain, so no one would have taken much notice of the sodden group of people who were leaving their home for good. Having escorted Margot, Meat had already arrived by bicycle at the Prinsengracht offices to help with the moving in. To reach the stairs to the hiding place involved slipping through a door that had been carefully concealed by a strategically placed wooden bookcase. The bookcase had been filled with the normal office paraphernalia of document folders so as not to arouse any suspicions from Mr. Frank's office workers. Even to this day, all visitors to Anne's hiding place access it by stepping behind this bookcase. So, the family have gone into hiding. And Anne has taken her diary with her. And it provides a great source of comfort writing in her diary over the next 2 years. Unbeknown to her, when she arrives at the room that she's going to share with Margot, her sister, Mr. Frank has brought a box of photographs of her favourite movie stars and football heroes. It might be my phone, but I thought I'd switched it off. So, I don't think so. So, never mind. Don't worry. It's a nice accompaniment. So there, if you visit the Anne Frank house, and I believe you're going to be visiting soon, you will see those actual photographs behind glass. Now, many years ago, I was taking the then Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex, around the Anne Frank exhibition. And there was a photograph of Anne's bedroom. He's now the Duke of Edinburgh, by the way. And I said to him, have a look at that picture, sir. Is there anyone at Anne's bedroom wall that you recognise? And he looked, and he looked, and he went, oh, there's my mother. And sure enough, there at the bottom left, you can see 2 little girls. And one of those was Princess Elizabeth, our late Queen, and underneath her sister, Princess Margaret, because Anne loved the British royal family. She loved the Dutch royal family, but she loved the British royal family as well. So there was Prince Edward recognising his mother on Anne's bedroom wall. So they are joined by another family after a few weeks, and that is the Van Pels family. Remember I said that Mr. Frank had a business associate that dealt in spices and sausages. That was Mr. Herman Van Pels, his wife, and his 16-year-old son, Peter. And then later on, in December, meet Lisa's dentist, a man called Fritz Pfeffer, a German refugee, desperately needs a hiding place. And so Mick speaks to Mr. Frank and said, would you take another person in to the hiding place, making it 8 people in hiding. And of course they discuss it and they say, yes, of course, they have to take him in. Which means that Anne can no longer share her bedroom with her sister for space issues. She has to share a room with Mr. Van Pels, with Mr. Pfeffer. She does not like this at all. And she gives him, this poor man, she gives him the most terrible press in the diary. She gives him the name Mr. Dussel, which means Mr. Stupid. And she describes him as a real buffoon, an old man. She doesn't like Fritz Pfeffer, basically, because he's a strict disciplinarian, and she doesn't go for that. And also he snores, by the way, she doesn't go for that either. But in actual fact, Fritz Pfeffer was a very good-looking, very athletic, handsome man of age 45, same age as my son. Nothing like how Anne describes him in the diary. So she's writing in her diary, and then by early 1944, Anne is changing. She's changing from a child that was rude about all her school friends to an adolescent. And her writing changes. She's taking responsibility for the world. She's describing how she wants to see the world, that when they're liberated, the world she wants to go back into. But also she's changing physically and emotionally into an adolescent. But she's got no boys around. None of these boys that couldn't take their eyes off her are around. Only Peter Van Pels. Now, they're totally unsuited intellectually and mentally, but they go up together to the dusty old attic on top of the hiding place just to have time together away from the adults and talk about their futures, talk about their fears, their hopes, etc. And they start falling in love. And Anne writes about this so vividly in her diary and what it's like to be in love. spring within me, she calls it. However, by about April 1944, she's falling out of love. He's no way is he her intellectual equal, and in fact he's getting on her nerves. And so poor Peter, she writes all this in the diary. But she's got a new passion by then, because in April 1944, the Dutch education minister in exile in London, Mr. Bolkestein, announces on the BBC radio, and by the way, the Franks had a secret radio in the hiding place, which they couldn't switch on, obviously, until all the workers had gone home, because they had to be deathly quiet in the hiding place for that time. And he said it would be a great idea if those trapped, the Dutch people trapped under occupation, could start writing journals and diaries, which could be published after the war to describe what they're going through. So Anne has a new passion. She's going to have her diary published. So she starts editing her diary, everything she's written before, with a view to publication, and simultaneously carrying on writing her diary. And her diary, as I say, changes into this, the words of a girl who has a real developing moral framework and responsibility for the world. Now, I can't talk to you about 8 people in hiding for 2 years without talking about these people. And these were the courageous helpers, Mr. Frank's trusted members of staff, who, not just for a week, not just for a month, but for 2 long years were risking their lives day after day to look after 8 Jews. Now that was some feat, because remember this was wartime, and just to feed their own families required rationing. So to feed an additional 8 people was incredible. And so they would spend, particularly Meek, would get on her bicycle and ride out to the farms to try and get vegetables and fruit to feed those families. So there's Mr. Frank after the war. He went back into the business, and there's Meek at the front, probably the best known of the helpers, and Bep, the young girl whose father built the bookcase, and at the back, Mr. Johannes Kleiman and Mr. Victor Kugler, those incredible managers who looked after everything. And I was very lucky in the 2000s and the 1990s and 2000s to have spent a lot of time with me. And then we are in Anne's bedroom together. And we even actually went to the 1996 Academy Award Oscar ceremony in Los Angeles together, because a documentary that I commissioned to mark the 50th anniversary of Anne's death and the liberation was up for an Oscar. And I'll never forget. Thank you. Oh yeah, okay, that's better. So we walked down the red carpet together, can you imagine? With me. And sure enough, the film by this incredible director and producer, it was called Anne Frank, who ran a wonderful documentary, it won. And so John goes up on the stage, watched by the auditorium of 1 billion people around the world, not with a glamorous movie star, but with a white-haired little elderly lady, and looking quizzically. And he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one." And when people realized this was the helper of the Frank family, the whole auditorium just burst into applause and got on their feet. I mean, something I will never, ever forget. So, that's me. Now, 6th of June 1944, American, Canadian, and British forces invade France. The liberation has begun. Anne writes so excitedly in her diary, D-Day, this is the day, friends are on their way. And this little girl who was always in trouble with her teachers at school writes, maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to go back to school in October. So you can imagine through that summer after D-Day, excitement in the secret annex that liberators' friends are on their way. 4th of August 1944 is a warm, sunny day in Amsterdam. At 10 o'clock,
someone, we'll never know who, makes a call to the local Gestapo office. There are Jews hiding on 263 Prince and Bracket. Half an hour later, a car draws up outside the building, and a Gestapo officer, an Austrian, accompanied by 2 Dutch policemen, get out, run into the office, go up the stairs to Miep's office, see Mr. Kugler pointing pistols. They look around, and they notice that there's a bookcase against the wall. And on the floor, they notice that there's some scraping on the floor from the bookcase, which means that that bookcase could have been moved back and forwards. They instruct Mr. Kugler to move the bookcase, and there they see the door. They go up the stairs brandishing their pistols, where they find 8 terrified Jews waiting upstairs. The 8 Jews are taken away, first to an interrogation at the Gestapo headquarters in the south of the city, where they're interrogated for 2 days. They're then put on a train to Westerbork, the camp in the north of the Netherlands, which is a holding camp for Auschwitz. On the 3rd of September 1944, all 8 of the Jews in hiding are deported from the Netherlands in cattle trucks across to Poland. 3 days of hell. Ironically, if they'd been found and arrested perhaps a month later, they may not have been sent to Auschwitz, because the Frank family and their friends found themselves on the very last train out of the Netherlands to Auschwitz. On the platform at Auschwitz, on the 6th of September, the men and women are separated, and they never see each other again. At the end of October, Anne and Margot are separated from their desperate mother, Edith, and sent on alone to Bergen-Belsen. Now, Bergen-Belsen was impossible to survive in that last winter of the war. There was very little food, the water was contaminated, and waves of the deadly disease of typhus were raging through the camp. Sometime in the spring of 1945, we don't know whether it was February or March, because there was no records, Margot and then Anne, a couple of days later, succumbed to starvation and disease and die. Their emaciated bodies are thrown into a mass pit with thousands of others. Of course, the gravestone wasn't there at the time, there weren't gravestones. That was put up by their cousin, Buddy Reis, a friend of mine, a few years ago. Now, again, ironically, if the 2 girls had known as they lay dying that their father had been liberated from Auschwitz in January the 27th by the Russians, it may have given them the impetus to just last the final few weeks until Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British. But it was not to be. Otto finds himself travelling across war-torn Eastern Europe to get back to Amsterdam. It takes him 5 months, of course, because the East is still fighting. Finally, in June, he arrives back in Amsterdam and goes to live with Miep and her husband Jan. He's desperately trying to find out what happened to his 2 daughters. He knew that Edith, his wife, had died in Auschwitz on January the 6th, literally 3 weeks before the Russians liberated. She couldn't hang on any longer. He nearly died. If it had been another 2 weeks before the liberation, he would have died. He was already 56 years old, and he was very close to death when he was liberated. So he starts looking for news of his daughters. And then one day he's working in the office and a telegram arrives from the Red Cross listing the names of his 2 daughters that are dead. He comes out of the office, ashen-faced, where Miep is sitting at her desk, and he said, "Miep, the girls are no more." And with that, Miep goes to the drawer of her desk and she pulls out this. "Here you are, Mr. Frank," she said. here is the testament of your daughter. He could not believe that the diary had been saved, because when the families were taken away, everything was taken as well. Everything of any value was taken by the officers to give to Nazi sympathising families, well, probably their own families. And in order to collect jewellery and small items, they had shaken out Mr. Frank's briefcase and just left the contents, the diary and all Anne's papers of writing, her exercise books, etc., just lying on the floor, the most valuable thing of all. So Otto goes away and reads the diary. He knew Anne had been writing a diary, of course, but didn't realise the depths of his daughter. I mean, to the people in hiding that had to put up with her for 2 years, she was just a precocious, feisty little girl that always had an answer, always answered back, but really never realised the depths of her personality. But what was he to do? Here was a moral dilemma. On the one hand, he knew that Anne had always wanted to be a published writer. That's why she edited her diary for publication. But on the other hand, she was so cruel in some of the things she wrote about the others in hiding, including her mother, her sister, and all the others who'd lost their lives so terribly. In fact, Mr. Frank was the only one that got good press in the diary because she had a very good relationship with her. So he consults a few friends, including a literary editor friend called Jan Romein, who writes an article that appears on the front page of the Het Parool Dutch newspaper. Everybody should read this little girl's diary, it said. And on the strength of that, a publishing company comes forward, a small Catholic publishing company called Contact. And they decide to publish the diary, just 1,500 copies, to see how it is received. Because remember, immediately after the war, the Dutch had suffered terribly in that last year of the war, and they just wanted to move on and forget the war and move forward. But hey, the diary is published in June. By December, it's a second edition. By February of the following year, a third edition. And the rest, they say, is history. Writing in a diary is really a strange experience for someone like me. Anne wrote in one of her first entries. Not only because I'd never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on, neither I nor anyone else would be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Well, not interested? To date, Anne's diary has sold more than 30 million copies. It's been translated into more than 70 languages. I was walking through Bangkok airport a few years ago, and I saw a copy in the Thai language in the airport bookstore. And every year, there's new dramatic and musical interpretations, documentaries, books about Anne's life. The interest never wanes. And in the 50s, there started to be an interesting phenomenon. As the diary was being published around the world, teenagers who felt that they couldn't really talk to their parents or their teachers, they weren't really taken seriously, they started writing letters to Mr. Frank. And every letter that Mr. Frank received, he answered. Not on a word processor like we have today, but on an old typewriter where every word counted. And I was giving a talk in a library in New York a few years ago, and a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, I've got something to show you. She said, and she showed me that she had written to Mr. Frank, and she had a letter in her hand from Mr. Frank. He had responded to her. She was a teenager in the 70s. She'd been so affected by Anne's diary, she wrote to him. And then she said, and being a polite, well-brought-up girl, I wrote back to him and to thank him for his letter. And guess what? He wrote back again. So she had 2 letters from Mr. Frank that she showed. So the diary is taking off around the world, and people are coming to see the Anne Frank house from across the canal, where the secret annex was. And by the end of the 50s, that whole area was becoming very derelict. And you know, about 1960, all those historical buildings were knocked down and everything was new. All these lovely concrete buildings were replacing the old historic buildings. So that area was going to, the Anne Frank House was going to be knocked down. So Mr. Frank got a group of people together and went to see the Mayor of Amsterdam and said, if we could raise some money, could we turn it into a museum? And they said yes, but not a backward-looking memorial museum. This was very modern. He wanted to build an education centre where young people could come from different countries, from different religions, come together to understand about each other and break down those barriers of hatred and discrimination that had caused the cruel deaths of his daughters. So there we go, in May 1960, the secret hiding place becomes public. And I was delighted to see that wonderful photograph, Arnold Newman's photograph of Otto Frank here in this wonderful museum. And there he is up in the attic where Anne and Peter used to go to spend time together. Now, by the mid-1980s, queues of people to get into the Anne Frank house were growing and growing. And one day, a member of staff was looking out of the window and he saw the people waiting patiently for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, and he had an idea and he went to speak to the director. And he said, what if we had a mobile Anne Frank house and took it out to the world? And so, in 1985, the first Anne Frank exhibition was created. And it was shown at the Westerkerk in Amsterdam, just round the corner from the Anne Frank house, and in Frankfurt, the city of Anne's birth, and in New York. And that exhibition came to Britain in 1986, and I got involved in 1989, and I've never not been involved. I've never looked back. And so, over the years, the exhibition format has changed. So now I'm going to take you on this whistle-stop. I hope you've got your passports, your cases packed. We're going travelling. Because over the years, that exhibition has changed in format. And it's become a smaller exhibition. Rather than going to big cathedrals, taking 3 days to build, and everyone having to come out to see it, what we've done is we've created small exhibits that go into smaller spaces, i.e. schools, prisons, etc. And what we've developed is a new methodology for teaching the story by training the teenagers in schools themselves to become our educators. Peer-to-peer education. It's been phenomenally successful, and in the UK we have had it academically evaluated year after year by the Department of Social Psychology at the University of Kent. And the results are just phenomenal on how it helps young people break down those barriers of prejudice, discrimination, anti-Semitism and racism. So for example, here in Kolkata in India, you see our lovely peer guide, teenage educator on the left, and these kids themselves made the connection. They didn't have to be preached to by their teachers. They made the connection between the discrimination that Anne suffered and the iniquities of the caste system that still happen in India today. Here we are in our peer educators in Japan. Now, Japan had a very strange relationship with Anne's diary, with Anne Frank. It was, believe it or not, one of the first countries to publish the diary in 1952, only 7 years after the war. But Anne became a sort of symbolic figure of peace. They never explained why Anne suffered. They never contextualized her story against the Holocaust. And it's only fairly recently, since the Anne Frank exhibit has been touring Japan, that the Japanese have really accepted the Holocaust. And now there is actually a Holocaust museum in Tokyo, which is quite remarkable. And you might recognize the gentleman on the right there, and that's Mr. Mandela opening opened the Anne Frank exhibition in Johannesburg just a few months after he became president. And he told us a phenomenal story of how, when he was a young lawyer, he actually worked for a Jewish law firm, and he was given a copy of Anne's diary, and he read it, and he just thought it was the most amazing testament to the human spirit. When he was in Robben Island prison for all those years, 20-odd years, he smuggled a copy of Anne's diary into the prison and encouraged the young political prisoners to read the diary as a testament to the human spirit. And it was read so much that it fell to bits. And the prisoners copied out the diary, the pages of the diary by night, by candlelight in their cells, so that they could keep on reading Anne's diary, which was a very brave act. And Mr. Mandela told that phenomenal story. And then the Anne Frank House continued to work in South Africa, working in the townships, those very impoverished areas around Cape Town and Johannesburg, going into really impoverished schools. And in this photo, this was in a school in Orlando, in a township near Johannesburg. And one of the boys on the left that had been trained to be an Anne Frank educator, he actually entered a writing competition run by the American Embassy in South Africa. And he wrote about what it meant to him to be an Anne Frank peer educator. And guess what? He won the competition. He was flown as a VIP guest to DC, and he came back. He was educated, he went to university, and that boy is now a teacher because of being an Anne Frank peer educator. And this is, believe it or not, in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. Now, this is the land of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. And you think, what on earth would these kids in the land of Genghis Khan feel they have in common with a Jewish European teenager who lived in the middle of the last century? But you can see there's the peer educator telling his peers about Anne Frank and how engaged they are in the story. And here we are in a typical multicultural, very multicultural school in London with some of our peer educators. We have worked in 100% Muslim schools where our peer educators are young Muslim boys, are very proud to tell the story of the Holocaust and be given that task. And here we are in Jaffna in Sri Lanka, which in Sri Lanka endured a 30-year civil war with the Tamils fighting the Lankans. And one of the very first cultural projects to go into Sri Lanka and Jaffna after the war was the Anne Frank exhibit. And there you can see Lankan and Tamil children coming together with, you see the lovely peer educator on the right there, to learn about Anne Frank and her message. And they decided they were going to create their own exhibit and take it out around Sri Lanka to tell the story. And they were going to work on it together from the two sides in the conflict. And I've just been in Mexico, and where they have Anne Frank exhibitions touring all over Central America, Guatemala. They've worked with street kids, educating them about Anne Frank, Belize, Costa Rica. And that's a teenage girl died in Panama. And this is the Anne Frank Center in Buenos Aires. And all over the US, the Anne Frank Center has been working. And as I say, we want to continue working. We want to have really strong programs on Anne Frank in all 50 states to mark the centenary of her birth in 2029. So I hope you can help us in Oregon. So there we are, Anne Frank. In many ways, an ordinary girl. In many ways, an extraordinary girl. But one who just wanted to grow up and live her life and do what she could to make the world better. But because of her oppressors, who only saw her as subhuman, Untermenschen, not worthy of the right to live, she died the most horrible slow death in Bergen-Belsen. On the 15th of July 1944, Anne wrote these words: "It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet, when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty will end, and peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realise them. Yours, Anne N. Frank." Well, of course, Anne was not able to realise them, but thanks to tens of thousands of teachers, of human rights activists, and most importantly, our young teenage peer educators, those ideals are being realised. So, thank you for listening. There are a few copies of my book that I can sign for people, and I'm looking forward to any questions or observations. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it seems like for 2 years that she's writing that diary, did she need more than one diary?
Oh, yes. The diary didn't last that long.
Yeah.
And then me, it was wonderful. She would go out and get books for her, like notebooks for her to write in. So when I said that they emptied Otto's briefcase, it wasn't just the little red check notebook, it was all her exercise books and the single pieces of paper. They were all left scattered on the floor. Yeah.
Thank you.
Kind of a trivial question, but Otto Frank went to New York. Did he speak English fluently? Was that
Yes.
common
Oh,
for
yes. Yeah.
people to be educated?
He was a linguist. I think he spoke several languages, but English definitely. And he was actually teaching when they were in hiding. Of course, there were 3 teenagers who were not going to school, so he was actually giving them lessons every day. And I believe one of the lessons was English. I think Margot had studied English as well. And of course, then he spent a lot of time in London after the war because Eva, his stepdaughter, married an Israeli man who lived and made her life in London, so they were coming back and forwards to London. So he spoke excellent English.
I think that's wonderful that they got the young kids, the peers. How did they come up with that idea? What motivated that?
Very interesting, actually. It was a colleague of mine from the Anne Frank House. He was Dutch-American, and he was doing a program. He was doing some work in Watsonville and Monterey. No, Watsonville and Santa Cruz in California, very near where I stay. And it was in the sort of late 80s, and they were doing peer education programs about HIV and AIDS. And he met the woman that had run this, and he was really inspired by it. He took the idea back to Amsterdam, to the Anne Frank House, and they piloted it, believe it or not, in the Austrian Tyrol, in these valleys, which were very sort of like isolated, these villages from one to another. And it really worked. And then they started, the Anne Frank House started using it. And then they suggested it to us in the UK, and we started it in 2007, so that's 17 years ago. And we started it in one, quite a tough London borough, Hackney, you'll know that. And we did all the secondary schools in Hackney, and it really worked. And we've never looked back. We've done it ever since. In fact, for 20 years, we were doing it in prisons as well. We were taking the exhibit into prisons, and some really tough prisons, Category A prisons, and training the prisoners to be the peer educators. So it's been a remarkable. If you want to learn more, have a look at the Anne Frank Centre website, annefrank.com. And there's a 3-minute clip on the website that talks about the power of peer education in this particular topic. She's a teenager. It's basically teenagers teaching teenagers about a teenager. Yes?
What language did she write her diary in?
In Dutch. Her schooling was all in Dutch. Yeah. Because she started school at 4.
We're talking about different languages. I was just like, I didn't know what her.
Yeah.
What language she was native to her.
Yeah, she was schooled.
She could speak German, couldn't she?
She spoke German originally, yes, when they lived in Germany, but once she started school, all her peers were Dutch, and her teachers were Dutch, so she wrote in Dutch.
Question here. So, actually, I have two questions. So, when you start with the schools in, say, Oregon or Washington, how does that process get started?
Either we hear of schools and we approach them if there's a particular need, a particular issue that needs resolving, or they approach us, they come to us and say we would love to do this program. And then it starts by taking the exhibit, which we encourage the students themselves, because it's very easy to build it themselves, design and build it themselves, how they're going to sort of place it. And then we send a peer guide trainer to the school, and they do the training. And we actually have someone who works with the Anne Frank LA Centre down in LA, but she lives in Berkeley. So she's a very experienced trainer, and she would go into schools probably in Oregon because it's not far away.
It's also strange that the little girl in the picture, the tall girl, was also a Nazi, but she was a friend, and then it changed very fast. This is my best friend, and now I'm with you.
That's right. Well, if you look at many genocides, if you look at Rwanda, if you look at Bosnia and Kosovo, those and how easy it is for society to fall apart. And your doctors, your teachers become your persecutors. It's very easy.
I'm sure that you know about this, but when I volunteered at the exhibit that came here, we added an exhibit at the end about all the discrimination that Oregon is famous for.
Notorious for.
Yeah. And that continued after we had to send the
Oh, that's interesting.
that one now travels to all the schools in
And it's still going.
I don't know if it's still going. It's been a long time
That's
ago.
very
But
interesting.
it was just to show, what we've done.
And who created it? Who created that exhibit?
I can't remember. I know one of the gals that was in charge is probably from the Holocaust Center that had something to do with it. But we've been very discriminating against blacks and Asians and you name it. So
I've been looking at the exhibit here today, and also I was at the Oregon Historical Society today. So.
Time for one last question. Okay. And then we can do book signing.
So I'm thinking of you as like the person that I've never met anybody who knows more about Anne Frank than you, and I'm just curious, is there a part of Anne Frank's intellectual life or personal life that you still feel like, oh, I would like to know more, and what part of that?
That's a very good question. I've never been asked it before, actually, because I think it's been so much chronicled because of Otto surviving and because of Miep, who knew her. And then I know, Eva, my co-founder of the trust, they weren't close buddies because they were very different, but some of her insights, Buddy, her first cousin, was a good friend of mine. So I do feel that I've been very privileged to have met and known so many people that knew her. I'll give just one small example. We opened an exhibit in a cathedral in the sort of eastern side of England, quite remote, Bury St Edmunds, in the cathedral there. And a woman came up to me and she introduced herself. She was quite elderly. She was in a wheelchair. She was Dutch. And she was a midwife during the war. And during the war, before the war, she delivered the baby sister of Hannah Pitt Goslar, one of Anne Frank's close friends, the one who survived, went to live in Israel, became a nurse. She delivered her little baby. And she, in the middle of this cathedral, in the middle of England, this elderly lady started describing Anne, the Anne she remembered because the Frank family came to visit several times because they were very close with the Gosler family. And it was quite surreal to hear this elderly lady in the middle of nowhere really describing Anne as she visualized, as she remembered her. So I think in terms of a little girl that lived so long ago, that was born nearly 100 years ago, we do have a very good picture of who she was, but most of all through her writing. It's all there in her writing. You know, and also it's very unusual. We have the writing and we have the photographs because he was such a keen photographer. So we've got an incredible composite through the people who knew her, the writing and the photographs. Quite a phenomenal composite of this girl.
If you would like to purchase a book, we have them available in the back, and then come up and get your copy signed should you like. And we'll be in here for about 10 to 15 more minutes and we'll start closing out. You got your book? All right.
Yes, please. Oh, yes, okay.
My friend Melanie, you know Melanie Ray, she's lady, like she has the dog, she goes out, like she usually does, so she starts with about it.
Oh, she did start
You want your coat too? Find that place that you like near the Avalon, that good, that lamp. That's what Melanie, that's what they about that. Melanie had me, I had that in my mind. That's what I know about that lamp. Like your salad. She might not be home. She has a machine.
Yeah, they will.
Jay or G?
I'm trying to figure out what I did with my card. It's getting 20% off, which I did.
It was so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you so much, it was wonderful.
I didn't do enough.